structure of the footprints, namely their remarkable consistency, their biomechanical appropriateness,
spanning the entire globe, involving hundreds of different cultures, explaining the same phenomenon by different names. At some point, you have to go, even as a scientist, you have to say, well, there's got to be something. It can't all be mass illusion.
Hey everyone, welcome to Out of the Woods with the Bigfoot Influencers. So happy you're here joining us, and we've got an awesome, amazing guest today. We'll introduce him here shortly, but let's take care of some business first. If you want to follow us, you can go to the Bigfoot Influencers on YouTube. You can follow us on Facebook, all the other socials. You can just, if you type in Bigfoot Influencers, you can find us. If you want to buy the book, you can go to our website, thebigfootinfluencers.com, or you can go to Hanger One Publishing. And we, again, thank you for all your support and the continued help. We enjoy each and every one of you. So today, super duper excited. Going to be chatting with one of my good friends, Brian King Sharp. Brian's, we'll let him introduce himself. Most of you all probably know who he is, but we'll do a little quick introduction when he jumps in, and then we'll get to it. Hope you guys enjoy this. Hey, Brian.
What's going on, Tim?
Hey, man. Everything's amazing. Thanks. How are you doing?
I'm hanging in like a hair in a biscuit.
Yeah, man. Yeah, man. So thank you again so much for joining me today. Dana's not here. Dana's working, guys. So I do a lot of these media ones solo, but she wants to get in, and she gets jealous when we do these. But Brian, you've been so busy. I mean, you're like you're just super duper. I don't know how you keep up with it.
It is definitely a full-time job, man, but it is the best thing I've ever done. I love it. You know, you and I've talked about that so many times about how much I enjoy what I get to do every day. So if you do what you love, it's not work.
100%. So you know what we're going to do today, Brian? We're going to chat about everything that you're doing. So the audience, some already know who you are, some may not know who you are. So we may have some new members out there, and they may learn something new about you that they didn't know before. So briefly, I guess before you get into the podcast thing and your channel and your network, you know, a little bit about you. You know, how'd you get into this? What'd you do prior to this? Can you share that with the audience?
Sure. It seems weird talking about it because I feel like everybody already knows, but I'll pretend like I'm talking to that one person who's never heard this before. I started out, you know, I was in law enforcement for 16 years. I have a cop background, so you know, I didn't really get into the cryptid thing until after I got out of law enforcement. You know, I went into law enforcement and we got out of that in 2016. So I was always interested in the subject of cryptids, Bigfoot in particular. You know, I had some experiences back in my childhood that I think may be attributable to Sasquatch or Bigfoot. But I really didn't talk about it when I was a cop because that's not something you go to work every day and talk about, right? You know, I was prosecuting, I did DUI for a couple of years. You know, I arrested like the most drunk drivers in the history of the state of Georgia in 1 year. It was like 300 and something drunks that I took off the streets of Georgia. So, you know, when you're doing those lawyers dig into your background, right? I mean, that's kind of what they do. They want to find some dirt on you to discredit you in court. And when you're testifying that many times with that many DUI cases, I didn't want to be the guy known around the precinct as the one who talked about ghosts and Bigfoot and UFOs, right?
Right.
So I kind of suppressed that, honestly, and didn't really talk about it much until after I got out of the law enforcement gig in 2016. And, you know, really in 2020, 2021 is when I really started buckling down and doing some research and really taking a look at when we bought 40 acres of property here in rural North Carolina and started having some weird encounters and weird things going on here. So that's sort of when it really started for me. And I started going into talking to people and trying to document some encounters and things like that in the Southeast. And that's kind of when the show started.
Super cool. So the name of let's start with the name of the pod. How did it start? Because you've got more than just one podcast, but I'll let you share that with you. But how'd you pick the name? I mean, obviously it's a subject, but you know, did you go through other ideas or, you know,
absolutely.
We all do?
I mean, that's one of the things I think any podcaster goes through. What am I going to call my show? And I've talked about this a couple of times on the show because of the name of the podcast. You know, the first thing I did was think, I want this to be a journey for people. I'm going on a journey. I'm going on this journey for myself to find these answers. And what's a synonym for journey, right? I don't want to call it Sasquatch journey. I want to call it something else a little bit cooler. So what's a journey? Well, I looked at the word Odyssey, right? And I'm sure you probably went through this. I know I've done it with Doug when we were trying to come up with a name for Weird Encounters on the radio network. We spent hours, literally hours, going back and forth in text messages and phone calls with me and him and Alex and Blaine, just trying to come up with a name for that show. So I kind of did the same thing for Sasquatch Odyssey. And I started taking a look at Googling, you know, what's out there. Is there something in the zeitgeist already? Is the name used? And I did all that stuff. And the only thing I found that was called Sasquatch Odyssey was this movie. I think it's called Sasquatch Odyssey, The Hunt for Bigfoot or something like that back in the 90s.
And it's a great documentary, by the way. Yeah.
Exactly. I've watched it. I just had Henry Franzoni, who's the drum. If you guys have watched that, he's the drummer in there. He's out in the middle of the woods playing the drums. Henry and I just had a episode, or we recorded for an episode that's coming up here in the next couple of weeks. So
Awesome.
I found Sasquatch Odyssey, and I thought, okay, well, you know, it's a defunct website that's not being used. I love the name. It resonated with me. I felt very comfortable with it. So I was like, okay, we're just going to go with that. And then when the other shows were born, you know, Paranormal Odyssey was born, True Crime Odyssey was born, because everything really is a journey, right? No matter where you're talking about Bigfoot, whether you're talking about the paranormal, whether you're talking about true crime, whatever the case may be. So it's kind of become the brand. Those are like the flagship shows for what eventually became the Paranormal World Productions studio / network. So
super cool. And for the audience, you know, so it's a little easier for me to pick a name when we did it. Well, we, you know, we've got our one podcast on the Untold Radio Network. You know, and you know, I just named it after the book because it's, you know, our podcast is kind of similar to the same idea. So, but when we came out with this one, I didn't want to name it just Bigfoot Influencers and confuse everyone. So Brian, you know, very gracious for that. He and I kicked around a bunch of ideas, and Dana, and we came out with Out of the Woods with the Bigfoot Influencer. So, yeah, thanks again to you, Brian, for taking me on that odyssey, that journey with my name of this. So.
Absolutely. And, you know, the 900-pound gorilla, no pun intended, that sort of came out of that was there was also a podcast called Bigfoot Odyssey, right? Carrie Arnold's show. Mm-hmm. And it was months and months into the show actually growing. And when it got some traction, people started, you know, posting Facebook groups and stuff. And they were like, well, are you associated with Carrie's show? And I'm like, I don't know what that is. So I found it was a YouTube channel. Obviously it still exists. You know, Carrie unfortunately passed away, but the show continues. So there's the Bigfoot Odyssey and the Sasquatch Odyssey. They are mutually exclusive. They're about the same thing, you know, and that's something that I met Carrie a couple of times. We hung out at the Smoky Mountain Bigfoot Conference last year, and we just never talked about it. We never even joked about it. You know, it's just one of those things that we had that mutual respect for each other. Right. You know, he stayed in his lane. I stayed in my lane. You know, he was primarily, that show is still primarily a YouTube channel, and my show we have a YouTube channel as well, but it's more of an audio based podcast on the podcast apps. So, you know, people have asked me that, you know, have you ever, did you guys ever talk about that? No, we did. We always talked about other things, you know, it was always Bigfoot. He was a huge personality and just a super cool guy to hang out with. So it just never came up, you know? Right.
So how, you know, if I'm listening to your show, you know, what can I expect? We'll just start with we'll just focus on Sasquatch Odyssey, and then we can touch later on the other ones. But what can I expect as a listener?
The main thing, the show was born out of encounters. That's what it's really all about. I wanted to give people a space to come on and share their encounters with me. I had a conversation with Todd Prescott recently from the Sasquatch Archives, and Todd and I were talking about it, and you know, I never really thought of myself as an archivist, but anybody who does podcasts, you really are. You're sort of an archivist in whatever genre that you choose to do your show on. You're documenting things that are going to be there in perpetuity. When we do these episodes and we put them out there on these podcast apps, unless we take them down, they're going to be there 100 years from now, you know, potentially 1,000 years from now. Right. Who knows? So that's what it's really all about, is the encounters from the people who experience them. The show is people coming on who have had encounters with what they believe to be Sasquatch, Bigfoot, and them telling their stories in their own words. We all learn as podcasters. I probably talked a little bit more in the beginning of the show than I should have. I asked too many questions because I was excited and I was learning the ropes and figuring out how to do it. But literally, I tell every guest that comes on the show is about you. It's about your experience. It's about your encounter. I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to let you talk and tell your story. So if you're into encounter stories, that's what it's really all about. I try to turn my microphone off and just let the person who experienced that tell it in their own words. And of course, we have, just like your book is about the influencers in Bigfoot. Unlike some shows, there are shows out there who don't necessarily enjoy talking to researchers or don't like to talk to researchers. I think that's important. I think that it's important to have a mixture. So in addition to just Joe Schmo down the road or Jan from across the street who had an encounter when she was 10, in addition to that, I try to also get people on the show who are doing the boots on the ground research, that are going out in the woods and trying to document the species or whatever their motivation is. So you'll find a little bit of a mixture. It's regular people like you and I who have had an experience. And it's also, Cliff Barackman or, whomever, Dr. Jeff Meldrum, Ron Moorhead, whoever that you may or may not recognize who is out there in the woods doing the boots on the ground research. So it's encounter stories. And in addition to that, maybe people who are somebody in the Bigfoot community doing the research. And then I read a lot of stories. I like historical stories. I like people who have shared their stories on blogs, because a lot of people won't come on and talk about their stories on a podcast like yours or mine. And they'll just write their stories out, and those end up being archived in certain places. And I have some great friends who have graciously allowed me access to a ton of stories. So I'll pull from those on occasion and do maybe one story, one episode a week where it's just encounter stories that I read. And I've also read a couple of books, audiobooks and things like that on the show too. So it's all over the place, man. But the majority of the show has been based around and continues to be all about encounter stories.
And as you know, I love this. I mean, I've told you this, but for the audience, I love the show. So it's mine, right at the top every week, when episodes come out. So when you get, Brian, you have witnesses, which is, I'm sure it's a lot of work. We've had a few, and it's a lot of work. And that's just me scratching the surface. So how do you get your witnesses to, where do you find them? How can they reach out to you? How do you vet them? What's that process like?
Well, in the beginning, it was a lot tougher than it is today. I mean, when nobody was listening to the show, nobody knew who I was, nobody knew who Sasquatch, and then anything about Sasquatch Odyssey, it was tough to get people to trust you, number one, because there's a lot of trust that's involved in this kind of stuff, right? For people to sit down, and sometimes I have been the only person that they have ever told their story to. And that's a lot of responsibility if you really think about it. There's a lot of traumatic experiences that happen. I think there's a lot of PTSD that's involved. There's a ton of things that go into these kind of experiences that people have. And to earn their trust is what I consider it to be. I earn everybody's trust that comes on my show, that trusts me to be the curator of their story. Now, they might have been on 10 other podcasts. I don't know. I don't really care at that point. When I'm in front of somebody and I'm documenting their encounter, they are the only person that exists in my world. I completely 100% dedicate myself to them and their story, because that's really what it's all about. And that's what I try to do with each and every person. So it's changed over the last couple of years, but a lot of people came from Facebook groups. There are a ton of Facebook groups out there where people share their encounter stories. And I would literally go in every single one of them I could get into that would allow me to post about the show and say, hey, if you have a story and you want to tell your story, come tell it on my show. Now, with the popularity of the show, it's grown exponentially. Thank goodness. I'm blessed to have the audience that I have now. It's hard to keep up with the amount of people that reach out and say, I want to share my story. So then you get into the vetting thing, right? We were talking about Jeremiah from the Bigfoot Society before we went on. It's one of the things Jeremiah reached out to me. He texted me a couple of days ago and asked about vetting because he had some issues with vetting people on his show. We have really simple questions. I think Danny, our executive producer, came up with like 8 questions that we ask people. It's nothing crazy. It's nothing out there, but it's 8 general questions about their encounter. Were there other witnesses? And then it kind of goes from there. And we sort of designed those 8 simple questions to really sort of weed out some of the more out there kind of stuff. They're sort of designed to raise red flags if there are any. And if there are any red flags, then we follow up with those and we go a little deeper. And I've talked about vetting a couple of times. Vetting is a very interesting word when you're talking about cryptid, any encounter really. If you're talking about an anecdotal experience, it's very difficult to vet at all. And I've argued with people about this. People come on the show and they tell some really outrageous stories. I've had tons of them. Some of them made it on the air. Some of them haven't. But when you're talking about an anecdotal experience, as an interviewer and as the audience who hears the story, our only job in that, in my opinion, is to put it out there. For me, as the host of the show and the person who's doing the interview, I simply put it out there for people to digest. I say it all the time. Take what you want and leave the rest. That's all I can offer for the audience. And for the audience member, you just got to listen to the story and decide whether you believe it or not. Maybe you believe pieces of it. Maybe you don't believe any of it. Was it entertaining? I mean, if you listen to a 45-minute story that you don't believe at all, were you entertained by it? That's really what it comes down to. So the vetting of that is really, really difficult. But we do ask those questions up front. We try to weed those things out. If there's just some red flag of maybe mental illness or, maybe they're making up the story, obviously we don't follow through with the interview and we don't air it if we do. I've sat through hour-long interviews that never made it on the show. I give that person my time. I allow them to tell their story. And if I don't believe you, I'm not putting it on the show because that's not being intellectually honest for me. If I believe that you've made up your story and I can convince myself that you may not be being honest, I'm certainly not going to put it out there for the audience. But 98% of the people that I interview, you hear it on the air. So the vetting process is different. It's definitely difficult when you do this kind of show. If you're vetting an expert or you're having somebody on that has written a book or they've put forward some huge piece of evidence or something like that, certainly you can vet those people. It's a little bit more difficult when you're just having an anecdotal story relayed on the show. Yeah. So that was a long-winded answer to a short question.
That's all right. Well, something struck me when you said, and I wanted to bring this up, I wasn't planning on asking you, but you said believe, and if you believe them. And sometimes whether that person actually saw a real creature or had an experience, they may or may not have, but it's what they believe they saw, right? Can you share a little bit about your experience with that or how your thoughts are on that?
That is a very good point. And I'm glad you brought that up because I shouldn't have used the word believe because I say it all the time. My sort of one of my taglines on the show is I don't have anybody on the show that I don't believes that they had the experience that they share. And that's a very good point because I think a lot of times it happens that maybe they have some sort of an experience and they believe that what they're relaying is true. Now, could it be different from what they really experienced? Sure. Could it be added to? Absolutely. And some people could just be wholeheartedly, just whole cloth making up the entire thing. I think for me, besides the belief thing, it's more about mental stability. So that's where I try to go. If I believe that somebody may be having some mental health issues or there may be some mental health issues on board, that's where I've drawn the line in the past about not airing a show. And I've talked about it a couple of times recently. I don't think you and I have talked about it, but I interviewed a guy about a month and a half ago who was sharing a story with me, and it was fairly mundane as it can be to be talking about an 8 or 9 foot, hairy hominid that's roaming around in North America that's not supposed to exist. It started out there and then it just sort of morphed into this weird experience that he said he had where he had sex with a female Sasquatch. Now, everybody I've said that to has the same reaction. And, I haven't aired that show because, frankly, I don't know what to do with it because I don't know how
Right.
people are going to respond to that. Now, did he have that experience? I have no idea. Does he believe that he had that experience? I looked the guy in the eyes and I do believe that he believes that he had that experience. Whether he experienced it between his ears and only in his mind,
Mm-hmm.
or he physically believes that he physically had that experience, I don't know. But I'm very careful about the show because I do approach this very seriously. I take the subject very seriously, and I want to do that for every single guest that comes on the show. So I'm up in the air about airing that show because it fits the category of it's out there, it's high strangeness, and most would say it's very woo sort of
Mm-hmm.
experience that he relayed. But does it meet the standard of, do I believe that this guy believes that he had that experience? I do. So where do you go with that? I don't
You
know.
always put it on your Patreon.
just put it up for the patrons to say, yeah, that's a good idea. I might do
Yeah.
that and see what
And just with a warning or something.
a huge
Right.
huge caveat. Yeah, a huge caveat here and say, hey, it's just a little out there. But yeah, it's a tough road to hoe, man, because I want to be intellectually honest and I want to do an
Mhm.
entertaining show that people enjoy listening to, and I want to highlight encounters. But I've said it before, that story versus a hunter who comes on and says, yeah, I was standing in a tree stand and this thing came up and snatched a deer from 10 feet away and ran off into the woods. Well, most people who are into the subject, me included, frankly, I'll just be honest, I'm more apt to say that is a reasonable story
Right.
versus somebody who says, I saw this thing walk off of a spaceship, or she came into my tent and we had intercourse.
Right.
Where do you draw the line? Because I'm reading Matt Pruitt's book right now, The Phenomenal
Mhm. Yeah,
Sasquatch,
me too. Yeah.
and I'm about 3 chapters in. I've been a slow reader over the last week or so. I haven't had a whole lot of free time to read, but it boils down in that book and it's basically the same thing across the board with this phenomenon. We can all agree that the phenomenon exists.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a matter of figuring out if it's a real, live, living creature that exists in this world, or does it only exist in people's minds? That's really the only question we're talking about. Anybody who's into the subject, I personally believe 80% of the time, it's probably a real live creature that people are experiencing. But then there's that other 20% that just keeps me scratching my head. And I have to say, I don't know. But I said all that to say, vetting is tough. It's really difficult to do when you're talking anecdotal stuff. And I still get, occasionally somebody will come on and say something that somebody doesn't agree with. And I'll have a listener reach out and say, how do you not vet these people? How can you not?
Right.
It is what it is. We do the best job we can, but at the end of the day, as a listener, you just have to take what you want and leave the rest and believe what you want to believe.
Definitely, for sure. So, have you had I'm sure you have, but can you share a witness that you interviewed that's really moved you or shook you, or it just, just stuck with you for a long time?
Yeah, there's been several, obviously 300 plus episodes into the show, but I think one that stuck out that was very recent was a hunter that was out in the woods with his dad. I think they were from Washington, and I don't remember where they were hunting. I may have that wrong. He may have had the experience in Washington. They were somewhere else. I don't know. They were out elk hunting, and it was a really long interview. I think he talked for like an hour and 20 minutes. I had people sending me emails and saying, that's the longest you've ever went without saying a word on your show. And I let him talk for like an hour and 15 minutes. And of course, people gave me crap because I let him talk too long and he should have speeded it up, whatever. But it was basically, in a nutshell, he and his dad were out hunting elk, and he has this tree knock situation where this thing is tree knocking this went on for about 30 minutes, and it culminated into him walking into a certain area and this huge Sasquatch steps out from behind a tree and basically confronts him. Now, this guy's got a long gun. He's got a pretty big, I don't know if it was a 308 or what he was carrying to take down an elk, but it was a pretty big gun. And he said he felt like he might as well had a toothpick in his hand at that point, because this thing was huge, and he took off running and left the area. But besides him just being a really compelling witness and just his story in general being very interesting to me, the thing that stuck out to me, I think, the most about his story was I'd never heard anybody, because this is the thing he said to me. And I'm sure you've heard tree knocks. People have talked about having experiences with tree knocks. I've heard something recently here on the property that I would consider like 4 power knocks. So you hear that. It's a pretty common thing in the Bigfoot community and the Bigfoot experience world. But the one thing I'd never heard anybody say this until he said it. He said he felt like this thing was drawing him in. And I was like, really? And he's like, yeah, because this went on for 30 minutes. And he said this thing would tree knock, and he would stop and listen to it. And he would keep walking, and he would stop again when it would tree knock. And it would, every time he would stop, it would do another series of knocks. And he said, I really felt like it was drawing me in to do something nefarious to me. That's just the feeling he had. Obviously, it's subjective. He has no way to prove that, but it is his experience. And I'd never heard anybody say that to me. But he said, it kept drawing me in closer and closer and closer until, boom, this thing stepped out from behind a tree. He's 10, 15 yards away from it. So that was really compelling to me, because I guess because I'd never really heard that. But when you have those kind of experiences and your gut tells you something, and this guy, he wasn't military, he wasn't law enforcement, but he'd had a lot of training in martial arts and weaponry and things like that. So he'd been around weapons, and he'd been trained, with people in those kind of situations. And I trusted his gut, and he really felt like this thing was drawing him in. And I don't know, it just really stuck out to me as a really compelling story.
I remember listening to that episode and him saying that he should have known better, that, just from animal instincts, hindsight after it happened, he said something to that nature, said, yeah, I should have known that's what was happening, but I didn't,
Yeah, he really felt bad about it. And the other thing that, if folks have listened to that episode, he was really torn up because his dad was hunting in a different area with him. And he went back to camp that night, and he didn't tell his dad what he had experienced. And that really shook him up. And he didn't tell him until after that trip was over. And he really felt guilty for a long time, to the point where he said he tried to bury himself in the bottom of a liquor bottle. I mean, this guy he fell off the wagon big time because of that experience. And I sort of related to that. I can understand where that would really eat at you, because he was worried about his dad's safety, but he was so shaken by what he saw and the stigma around it. How do you pull your dad aside at the campfire after a day of elk hunting and say, Dad, I want you to be careful tomorrow, because I encountered a 9-foot giant ape in the woods today while I was hunting? Like, how do you say that to somebody? I don't know.
Yeah, didn't he say that he didn't, like, the following days he didn't actually really go out and hunt?
Yeah,
he faked like he was going out and didn't go out.
Yeah, his dad would go out and hunt in his area, and he would drive to the area where he was saying he was going to hunt, and he would sit in the truck because he was afraid to go back in the woods.
That's just compelling how it could shake someone up that way. I mean,
yeah, it's crazy, man.
Yeah, it is. That's super cool. So, Brian, as we start winding down, best way for we'll talk about a little bit about your network, and then after that you can share how folks can keep up with you.
Sure. Well, the network is the 3 big shows are our flagship shows: Sasquatch Odyssey, Paranormal Odyssey, and the True Crime Odyssey. Those are all anywhere you get your podcast, anywhere you're listening to Tim and I right now, you can get those. Just search those names and they'll pop up in your feed, and you can hopefully follow the shows and take a listen. I don't host the Paranormal Odyssey anymore. It was sort of born out of all the really strange things that people are experiencing while they're out in the woods outside of Sasquatch. So I started that show to document more of the paranormal stuff: Dogman, UFOs, alien abductions, all the paranormal stuff, ghost stories, those kind of things. So Wayne hosts that show now. It is still up. I think he's 120 some odd episodes of that show in. So there's plenty of stuff for you to listen to. True Crime Odyssey. Obviously, I was a cop for 16 years, so I do the true crime show. And we've added a couple of other shows to the network. We have the Basement Hangout with Chad and Bob. They deal with all kinds of stuff, conspiracy theories, Bigfoot, aliens, you name it. They talk about it. And then the Kentucky X-Files with Tyler, Denny, and Josh. Same thing. They cover all things cryptid, all things weird. So you can go to paranormalworldproductions.com and check out all the shows there. We've got blogs for the shows. Anything and everything about the shows are there. You can check that out. And then obviously anywhere you get your podcasts.
Awesome. And then Brian also has a show on the Untold Radio Network.
Yes, Weird Encounters. Let me not forget about the Untold Radio Network and Weird Encounters. Weird Encounters is kind of one of those things that covers everything. It's a gamut. You know, if it's weird, cryptid related, UFOs, Dogman, you name it, we talk about it. And I read a lot of stories over there as well. People like, you know, the weird cryptid stories. And so I try to do at least a couple of episodes a month over there where it's just me reading some really cool encounter stories.
Awesome. And then you're going to be out and about this, upcoming months too. Where are you going to be?
Yes, you can see me. I will be on stage at the Smoky Mountain Bigfoot Conference on July 22nd up in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. If you've never made it to that conference, it is huge. It is awesome. They do a really good job. Cliff Barrickman's going to be there. Matt Moneymaker's going to be there. Renee Holland, Lori Wade, Tony Merkel, myself. Ryan Golembeski, RPG, is going to be the MC this year. So you guys come up if you're in that area, check us out there. They still got tickets available. And I will be in Idaho at the SquatchCon Idaho in August, on August 26th. It'll be me, Cliff Barrickman, Dr. Jeff Meldrum, and we just added Michael Freeman, Paul Freeman's son, the Freeman Files book. If you haven't checked that out, you guys check that out. We're going to be doing some really cool stuff there. We're going to be showing some of the actual Freeman footage, the non-interlaced version of that footage at the conference. And they're working on something really cool. Doug and Brandon and them are working on getting a link that people can actually attend that virtually if you can't make it out to Idaho. So I talked to Brandon today. They've had a little hiccup. They're trying to get the link together, but as soon as they get that done, I'm going to have him back on the show and we'll roll that out so everybody who can't attend in person can actually get the link to the show.
Yeah, super excited for that. So yeah, I've chatted with him a few times about that. So Brian, my friend, this has been amazing. So I truly appreciate you, sharing what you do with the audience. I appreciate your time. I appreciate all you do behind the scenes. A lot of folks don't know how kind and giving you are. So I just thank you for everything that you've done and continue to do. And we'll chat here real soon. I'm going to take us all out. So for the audience, thanks again for joining us. You know how to find all of us. Brian just shared how you can find him. You know how to get hold of us at Bigfoot Influencers. And we thank each and every one of you.